The internet seems to be holding up for now. I'll also record myself on my phone in case we do lose internet connection. And at least we'll have the recording in this version. Okay, so I'd like today to try and continue a little bit of analysis around the subject of what the definition of the melacha so I like seeing everyone move myself over a little bit. Yeah. And what the definition of the melacha of, no, it's fine, don't move. No, now I've got everyone lined up, perfect. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the definition of the melacha of oil, and then of Boneh, I'm sorry. You'll see why oil was a Freudian slip. The definition of the melacha of Boneh, and then move on and actually just begin learning the Mishnah and understanding the pshat in the Mishnah. So we saw last shiur already that there's the Av of Boneh, and there's a number of toldos that the Rambam told us about, or a number of co-ovos. He told us that Megavein is a tolda of Boneh. Why? Because it's Mekabitz chelek al chelek. It's drawing together parts. So like Boneh is putting bricks together, cheese making is putting the lumps of sort of cheese or fat and forming it into a block of cheese. Then in that was in Perek Zayin, where he's discussing the concept of Av and Tolda. And in Perek Yud, he says that Boneh is Boneh. Then he says if you smooth ground, for example, by removing a mound or filling in a trough, that's also Boneh. So in your house, if for some reason you have a house with earthen floor, for some reason you have a lump in the floor, you smooth it out, you're making usable space, that's Boneh, because you're creating usable space. Or if it's got a dip and you fill it in, that's again Boneh, because it's creating usable space. Then he says putting stone upon stone, or adding cement is Boneh. And he implies that all of these are ovos of Boneh. So at this point, we think that gathering bits and pieces together is the Av of Boneh. Cheese making is significantly different, so that's just a tolda. Then he says that making an oil is a tolda of Boneh. Then he says that baking a earthenware container is a tolda of Boneh. And cheese is a tolda of Boneh. Putting in the handle of a spade or an axe into the axe head is also tolda of Boneh. So why are these toldas? Well, putting the handle into the axe head or making cheese fit the definition he gave us of the Av, which is putting pieces together. And therefore, these are a tolda. They're also joining pieces together, but not in a building form, and therefore they're only a tolda. However, in the ovos, he listed smoothing ground by filling in holes or removing heaps. Now, that doesn't seem to be accumulating pieces together. Seems a very different melacha. Now, if that was a tolda of Boneh, I guess I could live with it, because we saw toldas are very different to others. So the Av is building by putting pieces together. The tolda is smoothing ground or filling in holes, which isn't putting pieces together, but it's still creating usable space, and therefore it's a tolda. But the Rambam says it's a co-Av. Very interesting. He lists this as well amongst the others. He doesn't even indicate it's a co-Av. He just says it's part of the Av melacha of Boneh. So is Boneh putting pieces together, or is Boneh creating space? Now, I can live with it being both if one's an Av and one's a tolda, because that's where we saw that toldas are very different. But he seems to consider them co-Avos, creating space by smoothing over spaces and creating space by filling in holes and creating space by putting pieces together. All of those are the Avos. And the tolda is putting pieces together, like with Kalim, the axe head into the axe handle, or the or Megavin. Then in Halacha Yudalad, he says making a hole in a lull to let air or sunlight in. He says it's also Boneh. Now I hear why that's Boneh, because it's construction work, but it's not joining pieces together, and yet he seems to imply that's the Av. So this is the mess we found ourselves in last week, pretty much. Just a summary of where we found ourselves last week. In brief, I don't have a problem. We've already got used to the idea that you can have toldas which are quite different melachas. We saw last week that even the shiur of the melacha can be different. Megavin can have a shiur of Grogeres, whereas Boneh can have the shiur of Kol Shehu. We've come to terms with that. We remember the Ron ben Arambam that rings in our ears that a tolda is not an Av. It's not another example of an Av. It's its own shemet melacha. We saw from the Gemara in Sati Hey, which I printed at the bottom of the first source sheet. Megavin is Megavin. Megavin is its own name melacha, even though it's a tolda Boneh. But what I don't understand is what is the essence of the melachah of the Av melachah of Boneh? Is the essence of the Av melachah putting pieces together, Or is the essence of melachot delineating spaces or creating spaces? I don't really understand which one it is because they both seem to be listed as co-others or literally others. Rambam doesn't seem to sort of spell out that he's noticing a difference between these different types of construction work.
So, building construction, that's what you're doing in your house.
The melachot is definitely building and construction. I'm wondering, and that may be the best answer we can come up with. I'm wondering if there's a tighter formulation, because the Rambam doesn't say that Boneh is drawing. What do we mean when we talk about building? So we have two examples of building so far, three examples of building so far, and I want to add a fourth in a minute. We have building, which means joining pieces together. We have building, which means creating usable space, which is smoothing the floor. And we have building, which means construction in the sense of allowing light into a chicken coop because chickens apparently need light. So those are three very different types of building. If the answer to Boneh is whatever builders do, then I'll live with that reluctantly, but it feels a little ill-defined because they seem to be three very different types of activity. Melachos seem to be formulated into a creative outcome and so on. I can live again with the idea that the Told is a very different sort of activity, but here we're talking about the Av. The Rambam gives three examples of the Av, and all three have a commonality that they're all about construction in some shape or form, but they seem very different things. And the Rambam, by the way, in Perek Zion, seem to define Boneh as so again, maybe we're misreading it. He didn't mean to say that's the definitive description of Boneh. That's just a type of Boneh. Yeah. So I don't. If the best we can come up with is building is what builders do, it's the whole question. No one's really ever been able to define philosophy beyond philosophy is what philosophers do. I would say to me it seems quite a vague formulation of what a melachot is. I'd like to understand better, but maybe we can't. At the moment, by the way, I have nothing better to say, so I'm not taking you through my own path of learning. I'm stuck here. I'm at a dead end, and maybe that's the answer. Anything which is what builders do is the comment. I don't know. Yeah.
For example, say smoothing surface, you're filling in holes, and those holes are being filled with materials, so you actually are, to a certain extent, in that case at least, you are joining materials.
So you're right, and that's why I also gave the example of Tel where you're removing the mounds. Because I don't think what's really going on when you're smoothing a surface is that you're joining materials together. But you're right, technically we could get away with it. We could say because you're putting holes in. But you see, the Rambam puts together the smoothing the mounds and the filling of the hole.
Yeah.
Removing the mounds is, if anything, more like Sosa than Boneh. If you want to think about parts being attached, you're detaching something. But the point is you're creating a new usable space.
Example of a hole in the chicken coop, it still remains a problem.
But even removing the mounds should remain a problem.
Rearrange materials very quickly out of Sosa.
It's Sosa if anything, it's detaching if anything. Now, obviously, it's not Sosa because it's creating a usable space. Okay? I'm not trying to give anyone any nachas over here. I don't really have any answers. I just want to share my pain. A pain shared is a pain halved. I'm not really understanding what Boneh is at the moment. Now, you may accuse me of making assumptions. Who says melachos have to be formulated so tightly? I don't know. In Torah in general, we do succeed in finding tight formulations. Good legal systems should work with tight formulations. Conceptually, it's defined as a melacha. I would like a better formulation than where we are up to at the moment. Okay, we're in enough of a mess now. We've found, yeah, yes.
You pointed us in the direction of a Mishnah on the Rambam in Perek 7, where he's trying to define what is an Av and what is a Torah. And in the definition of the Av, he says there's going to be some kind of inyan, or whatever the word inyan means. And the Mishnah then says that if it's different, either Be'efa Saku'ula or Be'efa Nifal, that's fine. It's not an Av. So the actions can be totally and utterly different. And the Rambam himself gives the example of promoting growth, which is Zarea, where you have a chopping action, which is pruning, and a planting action. So it doesn't seem reasonable, based on that the action should be something that the Rambam then goes later on to define binyan. So I think when you were just having that discussion just now about mekabik halokim, putting together of things, that should be the definition of binyan. I would kind of support the fact that you said it's doimela binyan, because it would kind of be surprising to define a melachot by its action.
So I'm pleased you saw the Magen Mishnah, very pleased, and I would reference everyone to the Magen Mishnah in Perek Zayin, where he talks about this very matter of what defines co-overs and what defines toldos. The other reference I mentioned is the Rambam in Perish Mishnayos in his commentary on Klal Gadol, on the Mishnah that lists the melachos, where again he talks about the definitions of melachos. All I will say is that you're entirely right, and I don't really understand any of this. The Magen Mishnah says that what makes something co-overs is a similarity in outcome or similarity in action. This is all possible, and it could be the answer is there are several categories of Boneh. It really bothers me that the Rambam, who's meant to be a systematic thinker, is just mixing and chopping and mushing all of this together it reads so, to me it reads so difficult, with such difficulty, what they're saying. And I also struggle with the idea, to what degree do we take similarity of action and similarity of outcome to make things co-overs, and to what degree do they coalesce into one form? It all seems very vague and arbitrary to me at the moment in the definition. Okay, again, it may be the answer is that we have to surrender, and often in many sukkahs you sort of have to surrender then the sukkah and say we have to rejig what our expectations are thinking about these things. At the moment now, all I'm pointing out is that we have one definition of Boneh, and maybe they're all accurate, which is joining parts together, makabetz chalokim. We have another definition of Boneh, which is creating space, smoothing out, or filling in. We have a third definition of Boneh, which seems to be a construction work, like creating a nekev, a hole in the building. Did we have any more definitions so far? That's what we did so far in the Av. There's one final Av, example of an Av, which, of a Tolda, which doesn't seem to fit any of these categories, and I would say is a fourth category, even though it's a Tolda, which is Oyhel. Because Oyhel is spreading a canopy or a roof. It doesn't seem to be creating space. The space was there anyway. It seems to be delineating space in an interesting way. It doesn't seem to be makabetz chalokim. You can spread a canopy without, at least in the normal way of things, attaching anything or joining things together. Maybe it's closest to lul in that it falls under Paul's generic construction work. But it seems to be its own category. What does an oil do, spreading a canopy? I mean, it provides shades. It delineates space in some interesting way. Maybe it makes space more useful, a bit like the hole in the lul. But it doesn't fit any of the previous categories in any simple way. And again, to me, it's a chiddush that's a tolda of Boneh. It's not obvious that it's a tolda of Boneh. Again, let's just, I don't want to learn the whole of Hilchos oil now, but let's just give an example of oil. I have a frame, let's say, and I just spread a tablecloth across it. Kids like playing and they build oil, right? They put together, they take a chair here, and they spread a blanket across it. That is oil. There's no joining of anything. There's no fixing of anything. It's pretty temporary. And in a moment, we'll see, either we'll have time or not time to see things a little bit more in detail about how temporary things need to be. It doesn't create space. It's not like removing the mounds or smoothing over the hole in the ground, but it delineates space. That's what oil does. And yet that's also called, in the melacha, it's a tolda of the melacha. And I don't really entirely understand why. Again, I know it sounds crazy because we're very familiar with Hilchos Shabbos, with baking and oil is like one of the classic examples of melachot Shabbos. Very few of us are bricklayers where we're going to put bricks on Shabbos, but we do make oilim the whole time, and there's a lot of ink spilt about this halacha. But it's not obvious to me that it falls under the category of melacha at all. And I was delighted, this is not my only idea, when I discovered, I hope I printed this, the Yerushalmi pointing this out, but we'll see the Yerushalmi in a moment. Yes.
The Rambam chaburah it's not an chaburah.
Yes.
I don't know what an oil is.
So we'll look at that later, but it doesn't mean that there's nails and glue. Yeah. No, it doesn't. Yeah, halacha it doesn't. I'm cheating a bit here, but it doesn't mean that. Yeah. So
you're redefining the space. You're creating space, a usable space. It's shaded, it's dry, it's redefining the space. It's more than just, it seems to be more related to the opinion.
I'm calling it a new category in the sense that it's defining space as opposed to creating space. But you may be right. You may well be right. Maybe one of my assumptions is wrong. Maybe this is called makabetz. Maybe this is like lul that's making a more usable space because of shade. Or maybe delineating space is as or defining space is as significant as creating space.
The opinion is about creating space which is usable. So it seems to be very related to that. Creating space usable, which is dry, it's shaded.
So I can't argue with you, and it clearly is within Boneh because it's delineating space. I'm listing it as a fourth category simply because I find it interesting that delineating space is included in creating space. That's all. Unlike smoothing the tell, it could be I'm being over pedantic here. I recognize that. I'm just pointing out that to me that there's a distinction between creating space, like when I smooth over a mound, and delineating space. If anything, I think maybe this is more like the nekev of the lul, because the nekev of the lul, I'm not creating space, but I'm adding to the quality of the space by bringing in and here I'm adding to the quality of the space by providing shade. So, but again, to be honest, I'm not saying any of this with great confidence, because clearly something's gone wrong here in my thinking about the sugya. But I'm pointing out my confusion.
Is the uncertainty about what is the Av and Toda is actually adding to our confusion about how you define an Av and Toda according to the Rambam. In other words, if you're uncertain about why these things are co-avot, it makes it confusing about how is the Rambam defining an Av and a Toda.
So you are correct that oil is only a tolda, and that's also interesting. All I'm pointing out is that it's not obvious to me that it's similar enough to the previous ones to have been a tolda. And whilst I was puzzling over this, I was flicking through the sort of raids and so on that bring all the sort of Maramakomas and the Sukkah, and I found this Yerushalmi. I'm no expert on Yerushalmi, but I came across this Yerushalmi, and I was delighted to see that Yerushalmi brings a view that oil is mutter on Shabbos. Let's have a look at Yerushalmi. Talmud Yerushalmi Shabbos Perek Kaf Halacha Aleph. Rabbi Chia b'shem Rabbi Yochanan hanotea onim b'Shabbos chayav mishum Boneh. Okay, Yochai mishum Boneh. Mishum means a tolda. Rabbi Zira ein elo kaposim mekaplim b'Shabbos. That you are only like someone who spreads and folds things up on Shabbos. You're doing nothing when you spread a tent. So spreading a cloth on top of chairs, what on earth could that be? How on earth could that be a melacha? So I was delighted to see that my intuition over here at least finds a place in the Yerushalmi. To me, it wasn't obvious that oil falls neatly under any of the three previous categories. Evidently, the Maskana is it does. Right? It is a tolda. So the Maskana is either, like Hillel is saying, it's close enough to creating a space, defining a space is like creating a space, or it's close enough, like I'm saying to Lul, that you're improving a space. I don't know. Good questions, but la halacha we do pass something. Okay, so
in a way, so can I say, in a way, it's more like Boneh than any of the others at all, because you're making a construction, you're forming a construction, almost a finished product, whereas the others are just small actions to, bring things together. But here you've actually made a usable, I know you can call it space, but a usable construction. So in that sense, it's quite makes sense to say it's Boneh. But it doesn't fit in with the other definitions, I agree. But from an intuitive point of view, it's very much Boneh, surely.
The problem is we're trying to unpick our intuitions over here as to what and trying to define what the melacha is. And I'm not convinced I have the intuition here, and I'm definitely not convinced that I have the legal definition over here. Intuitively, I hear if you set up a marquee and you hammer pegs into the ground, that would be Boneh. But I'm not convinced that I hear why just spreading a sheet across supports should be Boneh. And I'm delighted that Rabbi Zobin in the Yerushalmi says the same thing. You're just spreading a cloth. What on earth are you doing? And in terms of definition, I'm not entirely sure. I hear exactly what flavor of construction this is, unless again I'm missing something. And the real answer is construction. Stop being such a pedant. But at the moment now, I'm worrying that there's something I'm missing about definitions going on over here. Yeah.
If your understanding is Boneh have to be a case that it is some sort of relationship to the ground, to the earth. For example, the case of the lul that we were discussing, I think we learned previously, we were talking about removing and putting doors back into the lul. And we said, no, that's not a problem because you can't do this because it is attached to the ground. But is that the case with the tent means that it doesn't have to be attached to the ground, really. But when you say if you put a pad into the ground, then it's definitely a building. But if you just do it over anything which is not attached to the ground, so is all Boneh have to be something to do with the ground as a fundamental concept?
No, Well, we've seen that even though, and we haven't revisited the sukkah, but we learned the sukkah of Yesh Binyan B'Kelim or Ein Binyan B'Kelim, and we saw that maybe Ein Binyan B'Kelim, that's not because fundamentally there can't be a concept of Binyan with Kelim, but because maybe Kelim aren't choshev enough or something like that. But even if Ein Binyan B'Kelim, there could be examples of Kelim, and certainly the Rambam paskins that putting the handle into the axe head or kilning clay is Boneh. So, by the way, and this also brings out my slight worry with Paul's point, which is any building work. You know, what is Boneh, what builders do? Do we think of builders as putting axe handles into axe heads and baking? We think of that as a very different malacha. So again, it's not impossible to say that it's all somehow encompassed under a great big tent of categories. But I'm struggling a bit with sort of understanding exactly what the gather of the malacha is. So, okay, I've made notes for myself because this conversation is very fruitful in some suggestions. I don't know, this is where I'm up to. Let's for now put this on hold, and Rabbi, so if any of you are able to put me out of my misery in a good way, please let me know, because at the moment now I am struggling a little bit with the definitions. We've got 6 minutes left, so let's start learning the Mishnah, because I'm conscious that we're falling behind over here. But by the way, if you want me to challenge you further, I'll simply say the following. Can someone come up with an answer as to when making an oihel is a tolda and when it's an av? I'll give you an example. If you take a marquee and you hammer pegs into the ground, I'm not sure that the melacha there is asiyas oil. I think the melacha may be the av of Boneh. It has everything. It's on the ground. It's permanent, not in the sense of just my intentionality being permanent, but it has a degree of permanence there. I have attached chalokim. I have attached parts, and I've really stuck something onto the ground. Would that be the av or the told in that case? So I'd like, if someone wants homework, as it were, and says to me again, it's something so silly, Zobin, you know, this is all construction and it's all enough. And it's a reasonable point to make. But all I'm saying is Boneh is the tolda. What is the critical feature that makes it the tolda, not the av? And if I put which features in, would it become the av, not the tolda Boneh? I've given an extreme. On one end of the spectrum, we have spreading a cloth across 2 chairs that kids are doing, which maybe it's probably not derisive because it's temporary, but if I would do it permanently, it would be derisive. And somebody says, sorry, that's just pose mappa. On the other extreme, you have a marquee, or let's make a proper canopy, a fixed canopy. You put up a bus shelter, which has real foundations and in cement and so on and so forth. I think we'd all agree that's the derisive, the av of Boneh. What are the critical features that would make it switch to the? So this is another challenge I'm giving to bring out that there may be messy thinking going on over here, and we're not entirely defining what exactly we mean by the av and the tolda of Boneh. What is the critical feature? I'm being a little unfair here because I've gone through the raids forum over here, and the answers different achronim posit different things. I can give you a list, but I'm not going to, because I want you to bring that point. One achron thinks the point is that it's not fixed. Another achron thinks the point is that you haven't hammered anything together. You haven't actually joined something together. Each achron sort of comes up with a suggestion of what the critical feature is, and I'm sitting there just puzzled. Where is all this coming from?
If you build your bus shelter, isn't it possible to say that you're doing a av and a tolda, because the permanent things that you're doing, like knocking the things into the ground, that's definitely an av of Boneh, as we kind of described it. But then the actual canopy aspect of it could be something else.
So normally, first of all, when we do an action, we like defining it as one category.
You're doing a lot of work here. You're doing a lot of different actions. When
I've never put up a bus shelter, so I'm not entirely sure. But but more seriously, but more seriously, we'll discuss this a bit when we talk about makeh b'patish. If you sew the last stitch in a garment, or kosei shtei oisachas at the end of a book, is it makeh b'patish, or you can sometimes have one action which is several melachos, because the outcome is many things. We saw the Gemara says, you know, when you make a wickerwork basket, you're doing 7 melachos. When you bake something in the kiln, you're doing 9 melachos, and all these Gemaras that we saw earlier. Over here, you're ducking a bit the point I'm trying to bring out, which is if I fix a canopy to the ground, is that Boneh the av, or is that prisos oil the tolda? Yes, but it doesn't mean it's fixed with any permanence. I'm planning to leave it there permanently. We don't find anywhere that it has to have hammered to the ground or anything like that. We don't find it's about makabitz chalokim. It's the attaching of things. Yeah. Okay, so let me just let's start on our journey of trying to learn the Mishnah. Nah, we're not going to. Okay, so we'll stop here for today, and on Tuesday we'll continue to learn the Mishnah. I wish everyone a good day.
Right.
Quick question.